Oh, I want you to wait till this is done and then you can.
Okay, cool, cool. Oh, look at this. Oh my God. My God, you like doing that to the speakers, right?
Okay, go ahead.
All right, all right. So I'm going to share a screen here and go ahead and get started. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, let me expand this a little bit. I'm going to open it in Google and open things here. Excuse me 1 second. So as I was mentioning earlier, I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to hear, we didn't get a chance to hear some of the other speakers. And I should be joined by my colleague, Dr. Salinas. So, Christy, are you on the call? Are you on this? Hang on 1 second. She's calling me. Are you
Sorry, you
joined?
might need to just admit her as a panelist. I see her on the comments.
I'm doing it.
Okay.
I'm on it. It takes two.
What about now? Are you, let's see. I'm just making sure that Christy, yeah, okay, I see you, and then let's unmute you. Okay, and let me expand this here. Okay, can everybody see that all right? You give me a thumbs up. Good, all right. And Christy, let me make sure I got you, good. So welcome. It's the end of the day here, and we appreciate you inviting us. Thank you. Always grateful to kind of to share information. And today's a big topic, so it comes at the end of the day, and I don't want you to feel as though we're going to rush through everything. We have a lot of slides. At the end of the presentation, there are our email contacts. So if you'd like these slides, just email either one of us and we'll send them to you, okay? We'll hit more of the key points and then be in a position to really share the rest of the information with you. Also, I'm not sure if this is allowable, but if you want to stay after a little bit and talk, we're more than willing to do that. Christy, is that okay with you?
Yes.
Okay, cool, cool. So we'll do that. All right. And so this is the outline that we submitted. We're going to go through some personal path and influences, talk about power differentials in psychology and society, and kind of talk about the need to blend in certain processes when you make a change in how you learn. We'll talk about this whole homogeneity versus heterogeneity. There's certain things that extend into our culture and psychology from a statistical background. It's kind of interesting. We can really back into homogeneity of variance and how that may affect how we do our work. We'll talk about the role of social unrest and social justice. I'm sure other speakers have addressed some of this today. And then the compulsion to do change and a new model, which I would suggest you is new in some respects, but not new. Because I think some of our other colleagues have done this and have done it quite well. And then you have some objectives that are part of the CE requirements. All right, Christy.
Okay, so part of today is we want to make sure everybody's awake, alert. We're going to start with just some reflecting. If everybody can either have a pen or you can just think mentally, I'm going to kind of start with some ideas of our lives. So the first thing I want you to reflect on is your favorite gift. My favorite gift that I wanted as a child was... Okay, and then we're going to go to the next one. Dave?
I'm sorry. Well, this is moving quickly. Okay, hang on.
I was blank years old when I realized that skin color may be associated with less or more power. A time I realized that I had less access to resources compared to my peers was when I was years old.
Oh,
Oh.
well, this is weird here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit kinder. Okay.
I realized I had privilege in the field of neuropsychology when maybe it was a situation that where something happened. Next one. A client of mine who reminds me of neuropsychology healthcare disparities was okay. I visited my family member or friend in prison when I was enter in how old you were. I have a family member or close friend who has died due to racial, ethnic, linguistic healthcare disparities. Maybe it's you have several. Think about how many that might be.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to enter, throughout the presentation, we want to get us to reflect and have some of those woven in. So what about you, us, Dave?
So it's important for us to really think about our backgrounds, ethically, linguistically, culturally, the associated advantages, and how these affect our ability to do our work as a professional. I can just tell you briefly, and then Christy can add here that, so I'm a blend, like many individuals. My mother was a mestiza. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but she was half Mexican, half Filipino. Actually, her Mexican side is Indio, and Mexican, like so many. And the particular tribes in that area were Apache. So I have aunts and family from the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. That's where they were placed. There's a whole background that I always very drawn to in that whole area. But for those of you who are history buffs, you look up the Apache Wars. It's the longest war the United States has ever had. Individuals like Cochise and Geronimo were the warriors that were primarily behind that. And then I'll talk here and there about the advantages and disadvantages, but the one thing I'll say to you is the advantage of my background is I can blend. I feel like I can blend just about anywhere because you have to learn that. You have to learn to be a bit of a chameleon so you can blend, so you can pass in certain cultures. And that includes adopting idioms, adopting accents, and adopting the perceptions that are put on you by individuals. And I can't tell you how many times someone looked at me and they found out my other aspect is Filipino. They'd say, well, you don't look like a Filipino. Or you don't look like a Mexican. They're short and brown. I've had that said to me by professors from UCLA who are not on faculty then, but they're outside. And I thought, are you kidding me? But I was so young, I didn't know how to react. But the advantage that I have is I feel like it helps me. The population I primarily see are injured workers, cops, firefighters, painters, men and women who normally don't see mental health professionals, but really represent the diversity of psychology and diversity of the society. So they seem to trust somebody who not just looks like them, but can blend with them when it comes to understanding a worldview that they happen to have. Christy?
Yeah, I think, similarly, I think the advantage, so my background is, my dad is from Spain. He came after I was born. I spent a lot of my time there. I'm a dual citizen. And then my grandparents on my mother's side are from Poland, and they came in the early 1900s, because of what was happening there, wars and poverty. But then I have a blended family. My stepmom is from Honduras. She basically needed to have asylum, and she has about 3 years of education, and then became a business owner. Actually had a very successful salon in the DC area. And then my stepfather was from Argentina. So I think when people see me, I can be Italian, I can be white, I can be, I can blend in many different neighborhoods, and with friends and communities, and professionally too. So I think definitely being able to blend, collaborate. I think grit is something, that we'll probably talk about, but resilience in terms of that. And I think another thing is to understand, different traumas or disparities, be more sensitive to those, because of my educational background too, probably. So I went from, primarily Spanish speaking neighborhood, learning English in school, to then moving to New Jersey in the 90s, and having to go through speech therapy to remediate the way I spoke, and now it's a problem, because then when I go to hang out with my Spanish friends, I no longer have the theta because they took that out. So, all those different things, the way we speak, that also lets us know, like, are we in or are we out, right? And blending between those. Okay. I think we can move.
I'll just say one other thing here too that was a little odd, just last part growing up, and we'll talk here and there. It's not about us, it's going to be about all of us here, but I thought everybody had somebody in prison, and I thought everybody had a family member, nuclear family member in prison, and that everybody had somebody who was in a gang, and everybody had somebody who was killed. I just thought that was normal growing up. And we grew up, I thought, in a privileged way, because I had a family was lucky enough to send us to Catholic school. I found out later they did it by letting folks know, nuns in particular, who were the power brokers in our church, that we couldn't afford. They couldn't afford to send us to Catholic school and didn't want something to happen to us, like getting jumped into a gang during middle school. So I thought that was all normal, and realized that that's not normal in a lot of neuropsychology for sure, and psychology in general. Okay, so I want to do a short clip here, if you'll kind of humor us here. There's an anthropologist, and I think you have to really step outside of neuropsychology in particular and pay attention to cultural and physical anthropology. And I'm going to play a few minutes from Dr. Davis, who's a very well-known anthropologist and ethnobiologist. And let me see if I can back up a second here. So. I'll open this up a little bit.
A unique answer to a fundamental.
Let me back it up here. It's just fascinating, I think, but okay, let's do a few minutes on this. Dr. Davis.
I think in my lifetime, there have been two great points of illumination that have been sparked by the genius of modern science that will have shifted the paradigm for all times. One of them, of course, we all remember from Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged for the first time in human history to see not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And that single moment of awareness, suddenly the planet was not seen as an infinite horizon, but a blue planet, as astronauts famously said, floating in the velvet void of space. And after that, everything changed. I remember once I was on Everest, and a climber said to me, the most amazing thing about climbing Mount Everest was the fact that you could strap on your boots in the morning, under your own locomotion, walk to a place where the air was so thin that human life was not possible. And he said, if that doesn't tell us something about the thin veil that surrounds the planet, nothing will. Of course, that's an idea that would never have occurred to George Mallory in 1921, or to Eric Shipton in 1933, or Sir Edmund Hillary when he first summited Everest in 1953. The second point of illumination also came about
That's the problem.
as a result of a long journey, an infinite journey, but not into space, but in the very fiber of our beings. And that is a fact that over the last generation, biologists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true. And that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth. Race is an utter fiction. Indeed, we're all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of the Rift Valley some 65,000 years ago, and then embarked on this extraordinary hijira, a diaspora 40,000 years in the making, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But critically, if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, you have to accept the corollary, and that is the fact that every human culture, by definition, shares the same raw genius, the same mental acuity, the same human potential. And whether that genius is invested in the technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or placed by contrast into the challenge of unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no progression in the affairs of culture. There is no ladder of success that goes from the savage to the barbarian, the civilized of the Strand of London, that old Victorian idea that there was sort of a pyramid of advancement that plopped the Victorians at the apex and slipped down the sides to the so-called primitives of the world, has been thoroughly discredited by modern science and shown to be as much an artifact of the 19th century as a notion that clergymen had then that the earth was only 6,000 years old. And so in this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, modern science has proven the interconnectedness of humanity. And what this fundamentally means is that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. They're not failed attempts at keeping up. On the contrary, every culture is by definition a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the myriad of cultures of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. So that revelation puts into even more haunting profile the darkest statistic of our era. And that is the fact that of the 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, today fully half aren't being taught to children. Now, a language is not just grammar or vocabulary.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it there because this goes on for another 45 minutes or so. And let me go back to our slides here. Okay, so this is quite powerful if you want to listen to Dr. Davis, but it echoes much of what anthropology has been teaching us for a long time. And I'd encourage you to take that time. I think I almost went in the direction of cultural anthropology, but felt like psychology might be something that would keep me in the United States a bit longer. And I was, of course, a young sophomore at the time in college and just became intrigued with our field. There's a couple of other background pieces within our field that should be incorporated into learning when it comes to becoming a neuropsychologist in particular. And that is knowledge from the multicultural conference that occurred near where I lived, about 30 minutes away in 1999. These names here are important names. Daryl Wing Su, Rosie Bingham, Lisa Portia Burke, Melba Vasquez. Dr. Bingham is a more recent president of the APA, and Dr. Vasquez was the first Latina president of the USA, of the APA. And this cultural summit was summarized within, I'm sure many of you have read this, but within an American Psychologist article. This is the 1999. I want you to keep that year in mind. because in 1999, other things happened within neuropsychology, but they discussed state-of-the-art issues in ethnic minority psychology. And they started these difficult dialogues on race, gender, orientation, sexual orientation, and they developed strategies for a multi-organizational change process, much of which we're looking at now. These divisions, counseling psychology, gender, psychology of women, these other divisions of APA were founders of this movement. I want you to keep in mind what isn't there: clinical psychology, neuropsychology. But these multicultural themes that came out of this conference talked about how training institutions were not producing culturally competent practitioners, and that the concepts and theories traditionally were predominantly Euro-American in context, and they had limited applicability to the diverse culture within the United States. This is 1999, we know this already. And there was a demand for doing work that was relevant culturally, inclusive work, one that considered equal access and opportunities at all levels: personal, professional, institutional, and societal. And that just needed to be an ongoing topic of discussion. And this is where this theme of being white and white privilege began to become discussed within our profession. An argument would be that it was discussed much earlier, but it was coalesced within psychology here. Certainly the book, Even the Rat Was White, was powerful and worth speaking to. But this whole concept of being white versus being a person of color, with the belief of that if you are Caucasian or white, you had certain privileges that were unearned, they were accrued. You're not to be faulted for this, but being a person of color means you also accumulated deficits and disadvantages. And the thing about whiteness is that happens without you even knowing. And this worldview can be just normal. Hey, it's normal that when I go in a liquor store, no one's going to look at me as someone who's going to perhaps rob the place. It's normal to just be able to put a hood over your head if they can see your color as you walk through wherever, and they're not going to think you're a thug or that you're somebody that's going to create a crime. It's normal when you're lighter skinned to be thought that you're smarter. And these are biases that kind of are conveyed, and they start to define what's normal versus not normal. And they affect standards of practice, our ethics, etc. Now, there's another individual, and Christy, you know how to shut me up because we know each other quite well. You want to jump in here anywhere, you can do this.
No, I love it. I was just gonna add, or if you show emotion, right? If don't show too much emotion, because you know that might be a deficit. Don't cry. Don't get upset because you know you're not organized for the meeting or for the presentation or for your paper.
And I'll give you an example of this. Yesterday, so I had a meeting in our state with people who oversaw professional affairs and legislative advocacy, and we were talking about test security issues and the push to record our examinations. And it was going on, and it was really kind of detailed, a little bit obsessive and compulsive in the way one of my colleagues was describing, but he's so damn bright, kind of one of these Stanford trained people who just incrementalizes everything and is so bright. And I'm just fascinated by his intelligence. But at some point I had to stop and say, you know, we're talking about something that's wrong. And why are we allowing something to be wrong? And I got the response, because it's the law. And my reaction was, well, then we break the law. I mean, can't we be bold enough to break that law? Aren't laws that are wrong meant to be broken? And they kind of stopped and like, what to do? And immediately I started to flash out, oh no, here's that Latino dude again, kind of getting pissed off. And yeah, that's what they do. They get angry, you know. So I don't know if that was true, but it's like, and one part of me felt like, all right, I might've stepped out of line, but another part of me felt like, no, that would be completely acceptable where I grew up. That you can just draw a line, you get a little hot about it, and they say, okay, mijo, why don't we go outside, you know, and we want to get a beer or something, we'll relax, and then we'll kind of come back to this. They'd roll with it. I don't think these folks rolled with it very well, so I don't know how this is going to go over. Now, this is a gentleman here, Dr. Bill Parham. If you don't know Dr. Parham or his brother Thomas Parham, they're people to know. They're from the counseling psychology end of psychology and are 10 years ahead of clinical psychology and certainly 20 years ahead of neuropsychology, because they've been talking about these issues for decades actually. But I happen to work with Dr. Parham on the NBA Player Association's Mental Health Task Force, and I've learned a lot from him. His issue in 2005 was that context is everything with human beings, obviously, and that cultural groups are not homogeneous entities. Every person has a unique cultural entity. That's why we don't just check boxes, right? Okay, you're Black, you're Hispanic, whatever that is. You're Caucasian, whatever that is. We just can't adopt a bias without asking that individual more about their lived experiences, knowing full well that different paradigms govern how people view the world. And the more Western viewpoint strives to support independence, competitiveness. I mean, look at our achievements and you know, all due respect, but look at what you put up about me. What was last was the, you know, black belt, but everything was achievement oriented. And of course, that's what people pick up, but I'm a grandfather. I have a new granddaughter. I'm a husband. You know, I do other stuff, but what's portrayed and what's valued is what's displayed. And that's okay, but that's what you're putting worth on by definition because of a bias, that this is important. And that's all right. But I would suggest to you that there's a worldview governing what we value as far as someone's pedigree. There's another worldview that values connectedness, mind-body interrelatedness, spirituality, a deference to a higher power. I can't tell you how often I hear from my patients when they're in difficult situations. What do they say? Gracias a Dios, or poco a poco. They'll say different things, and there's some dichos in Spanish that translate so well. One was for a family that had a daughter that had leukemia. She was not going to survive. But I remember them saying, you know, where there's thunder, where there's rain, there's thunder, and Spanish, and just trying to convey that it's just not going to get better. Things are going to be difficult, and it somehow helped them. But the point of from Dr. Parham more recently, and this is in sports psychology, is that you really have to value the person behind the performance, you know, more of a personal viewpoint here. And, you know, this is what we emphasize when we do psychotherapy with athletes. A couple other points here. Dr. Gallardo, he's my compadre. So I baptized his daughter, and his point here about viewing white as an ethnicity is important, and that we always start with someone's race or their perception of their race. And the critical place here is, what is that person's background? And he really places an emphasis on the personal stories of professionals, because he believes that helps you understand what they had to go through to get where they are, and then how that viewpoint will support how they do their work. And his podcasts, which I've hyperlinked here, are excellent. They're conversational, they're personable, they're very much how Miguel really presents. And he's in addition to being my compadre, he's my one of my best friends here. So I'll leave you with this, but it's basically a Louis Valdez poem. And on the screen on your left, I believe that's Mayan. Now we have Jeff Corey's article, which is interesting, right? Unpacking your knapsack when it comes to white privilege in neuropsychology. Just a few points here, and then Christy, I'm curious what you think here. But basically, it really comes from an individual who knows what he's talking about. I didn't train Dr. Corey. I was one of his supervisors, but he kind of trained himself. He was that smart at UCLA. But the point is, our field has been inadequate in terms of response to the changing demographics of the United States and being responsive to that from all levels: recruitment, getting the right people in the workforce, psychometrics. How often are you forcing somebody into the heat and et al. Norms? How often do you force them into those? And how often are you in fact looking for other normative standards that may apply, or at least saying that those standards don't apply? At least disclosing the limitation. We disclose limitations everywhere else, but it seems like we're reluctant to disclose limitations about our own instrumentation for whatever reason. Isn't that an ethical obligation?
And
then
science. So if you think of areas like epilepsy, for example, which are one of the most well-defined areas in research and really developing neuropsychology, and you just do a PubMed search. I did that about 5 years ago, looked at 600 abstracts in epilepsy, and you put in culture, diversity, anything like that with epilepsy as a key word, and you receive 8 papers only in the field. So
Yeah.
showing again the inquiry, the science that's being developed. Other areas that I've found, because they're areas that I've studied in, concussion, for example. When I started back in 2004, I was a college basketball player, and that's what got me involved with neuroscience. And I'm looking into data for Black girls playing basketball, Latino girls playing basketball. Where's the science? There's millions of people playing basketball and other sports that are, pretty common when you live in an urban area. Cheap, you just got to get shoes and, dribble your ball. There were no papers in that area. Other areas like pediatric neuropsychology, there was a paper published. I know Desiree Bird presented before us. Back in 2008, she
Right.
wrote a paper with my mentor, Mike Westervold, and they looked at over 1,000 papers in the field of pediatric neuropsychology. And they looked for any articles that just had one standardized neuropsych measure, just one, and was given to a cultural or ethnic group in children. And they found less than 10 papers in the entire field. And so just giving examples of, the privilege effects, the politics, the sociopolitical climate, and our own culture and our field drive the science that we're trying to answer.
Exactly. I tell you, the easiest case for me, someone comes in who's Caucasian, and I always ask, tell me about your racial and ethnic backgrounds. And a lot of people say, what? Well, I'm Caucasian. Well, where's Caucasia again? I know there's a Caucasus, in Russia, but where's Caucasia again? And I'm poking with them a little and playing a little bit, but always ask about that. But the easiest examination is someone, let's say, from the Midwest, speaks English primarily, educated in the United States, has a traumatic brain injury. This is all right in my sweet spot when it comes to the norms that I have available. The hardest one, say an individual from the mountains in Oaxaca who speaks one of the Nahuatl dialects. English is his better language, Spanish is his third language, and he has a maybe primaria education, so very few years, and the quality of which is very poor because he had to work crops in between going to school. That's a tough one. And he has the same traumatic brain injury. That's harder. Now, then in 1999, remember what I referenced earlier, just a few points here. These are the Houston Conference guidelines. And, this is where you have to kind of, as somebody with my background, Christine will say what's up for her, but this is where you have to temper your rage. This is the only part of the guidelines that talks about diversity. The only part. One section, diversity in education and training, and then blah, blah, blah. Attempt to actively involve, that adverb probably should be after involve, but attempt to involve, recruit individuals from diverse backgrounds at all levels of education. Okay, it's all nice. That's it. And these are the guidelines that are being revised, but these are the exit criteria for fellowship training. ABCN being one of the boards, I looked through this, nothing with respect to cultural competence, nothing. So these are current. ABPN, the other board, the two boards fight each other. There's hair pulling contests that go on. It has to do with power and privilege. We're smarter than you. We train better than you. We put out better, it's amazing. It's still neighborhood fights going on. Nothing with respect to diversity and cultural competence. And why? Look at the changes. You see these slides all the time. They can become nauseatingly familiar. But the norms that are based on a declining population are not helpful. The norms that are from multicultural individuals are going to be more beneficial. And you could see that look at 2025, this is the US here. Things are shifting, and certainly we have initiatives like 2050, but certainly by 2065, Caucasian is going to be a minority when you add up all the other individuals and their ethnic backgrounds.
And I have to add here that, a lot of our cultural neuropsych work is really in aging. So when we look at the demographics, especially Latino groups, they're one of the youngest groups. We have a lot more millennials, children just coming in, especially post Hurricane Maria, right? Like, so I live in Orlando, and over 200,000 people have moved from Puerto Rico to Central Florida. And so think about the norms that we have for bilingual children just coming in, not really applicable at this point.
Right. So there's more, topics here about how we can group this here, but the projections are straightforward. I think everybody knows this, that the Hispanic population is going to increase in every part of the country. Hispanic, by the way, is a broad term. We know that. In fact, it only became public as a term in 1980 as part of the census. And the white population, whatever that is going to fall in many areas in the Northeast and the Pacific Coast, may grow in others. There's some linguistic and language diversity issues. I won't spend too much time on this, but I just want to remind all of you that think about the beginning of this country, 1776, 40%, certainly in the, interesting in Pennsylvania, and several of you probably have this background in you, but 40% spoke German in the United States, or the inception of the United States. The other majority spoke some American Indian or indigenous language or an African language. But fully 1/3 spoke a language other than English. And then there's certain changes that occurred. Louisiana Purchase, country land doubles. There's a whole political situation behind that. Same with the Adams-Onis Treaty. That's kind of a trade with Spain, right? It's a power trade, where Florida was given to the US in exchange for us saying, okay, Spain, you can have California. Go ahead and have your ranchos over there. And then we had the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, which basically, okay, US then acquired half of Mexico around the time of the Mexican War, the war with Mexico. And there are changes, obviously, that affected linguistic complexity. This is not to mention Alaska or Hawaii. Hawaii is probably the most multicultural state. Alaska is very interesting because it also, if you've ever been to Alaska, you see a large Russian population, given it was really a Russian colony before, that mixes in with the indigenous population. Okay, so there's just a few other points about this, but keep in mind our ancestors in the United States and where they came from when. Germans and Celts, Scandinavians, Slavs, Jews, Italians. At certain times, in 1910, this was the population broken down by 10 million increments or immigrants. And the worry politically, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, is that that immigration somehow is going to fragmentize. The term Balkanize is used a lot to refer to this particular area in Europe. But typically what happens with languages, according to experts, is by the third or fourth generation, the language that came with the individual fades. However, economically, it's very advantageous. And I would say from a healthcare perspective, it's critical for individuals to be multilingual. Think of Europe.
If you guys have read Dr. Artiola's chapter, one of the things I like is she's called "The U.S. is a language grave." So it's where languages come to die. When you look at many other countries around the world, bilingual is actually, not even the norm. It's trilingual, right? It's 3-4 languages, tribal languages, indigenous. So, yeah. So, okay. I think Dave, this is just a video I wanted to show. This is a time I went to Peru for a month with my husband. Oh, we're going to play the video. Go back. And basically this family,
I can't try to get it to play.
Oh, you can't get it to play? Just click on the bottom left.
Shoot, it moved forward.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a shame. this family, it was showing the difference of the power of education. Um, this family that's a mom who has basically hiked 3 hours to pick her kids up from school, and I am playing marbles with them in an Inca temple on the top of the mountain, and they're teaching me. They have never seen a camera. They saw my camera and it was like a robot from the 21st century. And at the same time, they were playing marbles and doing yoga moves with me in this middle of this sacred temple. And what it showed me was the power of perseverance and education that has been instilled in this generation now. This was only a few years ago compared to, kids where I live now that are getting dragged by their ears to go to school in the morning by, my friends' kids and my own son sometimes. So I thought it was a good juxtaposition. Okay, we can move forward. I think the next slide that I wanted to talk about was related to migration patterns, but this is current and obviously personal for me since you learned that my family's from, my stepmom and step siblings are from Honduras. And it's looking at the reasons why they're leaving. And, if you read Twitter or anything, you might be hearing something else from our leadership. You can see that the majority are coming for family or opportunity, violence in their neighborhoods, abuse, difficulty with deprivation or other reasons. You can see a story that you may hear, right? The man who took my sister asked if he should return her in a box or a bag. So I do quite a bit of refugee work. I do evaluations when children are coming to Orlando. There's a refugee center. And as part of reuniting with a family member that may have moved here, they have to get neuropsych evaluations, and then they get treatment and a plan for their school and different resources. But this is where trauma unfolds. And if we can go to the next slide. One of the things that I've realized as I've been alluding to the neuroscience is I feel like in almost every area that's an interest of mine, I find that there's really no research to back it up. And so we know that, again, trauma-informed care and mental health and counseling, or if you want to work in any kind of mental health setting, is the gold standard. And I was shocked, actually. If you go into PubMed and search trauma-informed neuropsychology, there's no papers written about that. This is actually another reason that I got involved in neuropsychology. I did quite a bit of work before going in grad school. Talk about defunding the police and things. I actually, back in like 99, 98, 99, I used to work with cops in the back. And basically when there was a call, I had a beeper and we'd go in the back and kind of show up and I'd help with crisis intervention. I also did that with women that had, I was a rape advocate. And so I learned a lot from that and foster care that, as we know that the functional connectivity, there's issues with frontal limbic anatomy changes. Children, a lot of these models come from veterans, VA system with neuropsychology, but we know that children are not equal to adults. We know that, PTSD can have, so depending on the age, the type, or the chronicity of the trauma, that may have different cognitive profiles. There may also be social dysfunction that occurs. So this is kind of my attempt to build a model of what that looks like. Kids with trauma have increased threat processing. We could pick up potentially on different facial cues, adaptive response or resilience. I think that's another area of research to look into. Stigma and support, and how that impacts the altered developmental course over time. Also, how does this impact economics, macro and micro level? I remember, for example, training in Buffalo for undergrad psychology, and one of the things I did was work in a school guidance office, and they had a truancy court. And one of the things that happened was these kids had basically, there was a gunshot, somebody was, had died over the weekend. And now on a Monday, there's a judge that's basically talking to them and they're families about putting them in jail or getting in trouble in juvenile detention, instead of looking at why is violence or trauma happening and what can we do, what's a prevention method. Instead, there was a lot of consequences and behavioral discipline. We find that still today in Florida. I know, like from Brevard County leads the counties in Florida on suspensions of kindergartners. And we find that it's happening disproportionately to Black and Latino kids. And they have that data that they've just been presenting currently. So I think this is really important when we think of the long-term, if you're familiar with Jen Manley's work with dementia and literacy being tied to that, it's really starting to happen in early on in education and what's driving literacy or educational attainment in the first place. We can move forward.
Okay,
Go ahead, Dave.
we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to hit some highlights and give you some references here, but just let's talk about traditional leadership. We'll be doing some more work on cultural and multicultural leadership, but I want to give you some of the texts that are often given to people who are board members. You may have this in CPA as well, but a lot of people reference John Carver, and this is an earlier work, but I'm currently reading this as part of a nonprofit board. It's considered authoritative, but there's no discussion on culture and leadership. This is 2006. And diversity is only discussed when it comes to tolerating differences of opinions. And how do you tolerate them? You have rules ahead of time to make sure people stay in their lane, and that you have rules to resolve conflict. And then this is, I have to be careful because it's another pet peeve. Many of us use Robert's Rules of Order. And I've always had this thing with who is Roberts. So I looked them up. Not surprisingly, remember my background? Apache. He's a U.S. Army guy around the time of the Apache-American Wars. So I know I had a vibe here against this guy. But be that as it may, this is really well-intentioned here. This is a gentleman who wrote his rules because he was in a church in New Bedford, and everybody was probably crazy trying to come up with some solutions to whatever they were dealing with. So he said, that's it. I'm going to write some rules here. So he wrote these parliamentary rules, and they became adopted and then continually revised by his grandson here. But this is Robert's Rules of Order that we adopt. But I think there's some other rules that we talk about.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've become very interested in is leadership. As we learn about cultural competencies, we learn about neuropsychology competencies, and then as we move forward in our career, we start to get involved with organizations. So I looked at, again, are there any texts to drive competencies in leadership and neuropsychology? And I could only find 4 articles ever written on leadership and neuropsychology. One is 3 are about women's issues. Only 1 really looks at, they asked a few questions of women leaders and then they got some data. There's nothing about a model of leadership. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what is a cultural leader? And I think what I've learned in just my work at the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society, along with Dave, who's been a mentor of mine for 12 years now, is that just like artists who are kind of creating a culture, in many ways, we're discussing topics, maybe even creating new topics or new areas of scientific inquiry. And with that, we have to go back to what were the advantages of our culture. Sometimes we find ourselves, right, when we talk about imposter syndrome early on in leadership, but over time is how to get out of the comfort zone, right? So there's kind of the place where we feel safe, we're in control. Then there's the fear zone, finding, reasons to say no, maybe trying to acquire new skills, maybe become more competent, then I'll be ready, versus the growth zone. So that's kind of where you think big, you're more comfortable with who you are, you set a goal, you know you can achieve it. We can move forward.
Okay.
And then the next part is, you've heard Dave talk about cultural humility, and I think about it from cultural humility being a value proposition in organizations. So it can increase the ability to see each other's viewpoints, understand each other's backgrounds, especially if you're working on a board with people from different backgrounds. Ultimately, it helps with working together, being more cohesive, more operational efficiency. So, if you think about it almost from an HR standpoint, it actually has better outcomes as an organization. And it's a lifelong process, but it helps with empowerment and some of the power privilege issues that we discuss. You can move forward. This is my attempt to kind of think about cultural leadership in a framework. So think about our organizations kind of stepping back wherever you work in your department or neuropsych guilds, having an actual commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. What does that look like? Are there, anti-discrimination policies? What does that look like in terms of implementation? Embedding culture within the organization. So, hey, probably when you joined your hospital, there's a logo, there's a orientation, there's a, that's all indoctrinated you into how, you operate every day. Same thing would go for, from a cultural standpoint. It ranges not only, we talked a lot about pipeline in terms of getting neuropsychologists into the field. I haven't seen anything about ranging of executive level searches, cultural change services to daily operations, even the way we hold meetings, the way we hold conferences. We've kind of learned that there's one person up at the podium versus multiple interactive, immersive kind of experiential types of learning that go back to maybe some of our traditions in terms of storytelling or listening to, your grandparent who shared something when they were a kid. Connections to diverse leaders can help with the industry or a field. Partnership with organizations, so having more interorganizational crosstalk. Again, diversity is a disruption factor. So in other industries outside of neuropsychology, so global corporations, Coca-Cola, I think of McDonald's, anywhere you traveled, you probably see how they've really embedded in that culture, and then they change their menu, the way they operate, all of that. That's also another area that neuropsychologists can get into is consulting. Okay, we can move forward.
We got about 7 minutes.
Okay. So real quick, this is another way to look at social justice. So I think, you've probably heard Dave allude to a little bit of Catholic background. I think social justice is a way that we view that being correct in our human kind of neuropsychological science attitude. One of the things as part of our backgrounds may be more rooted in like mercy, forgiveness, compassion. But these are deep-rooted systems of racial inequity, and this is a model to look at how you can actually operationalize it and make change in an organization. Okay, we can move forward, Dave. Another thing that I would like to see more of is things like strategic leadership. So how do we go from an individual that becomes competent, right, is the exit criteria to be a neuropsychologist, to then being a contributing team member at your department or on a board? How do you become a manager? How do you become an effective leader? Or then at the executive level, which then really has to do with personal humility, right? How do we lead? How do we listen to our people on our team or people that are learning? Next.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, so these are more for your own consumption here. There are models out there on more Latino and multicultural leadership. So just want to highlight these. There's 2 books that are written by Juana Bordas. She's an activist and she is amazing. These are excellent books. Pick them up on Amazon. Culture, Inclusion, and Contribution, The Power of Latino Leadership. And this one, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit. Now it looks from these ethnic backgrounds, Latino, Black, and American Indian, but just to highlight some of the principles that are certainly part of my culture. These are things that we naturally have. And I think you see this in Hispanic Neuropsychological Society. And a couple of things here: de colores, inclusiveness, diversity, multi-generational, collective identity. Adelante. We got to go forward here. And we don't assimilate as much as give up our culture. We acculturate, kind of blend, but we keep our culture. And this si se puede, we can do this, is usually something that's used more politically these days. But also at the same time, you have to kind of feed the soul a bit. It is gozar la vida, it's the celebration, being together with each other is some way that we need this as we evolve. And then faith and hope, spirituality, this obligation to assist others. I won't spend this is summarizing. This is her other book, Crafting Multicultural Leadership Model. It talks about inclusiveness, value diversity, diverse cultures. And there's just a couple things here. There's a phrase, sankofa, kind of learning from the past, more of an African phrase here, being attentive to that, really moving from individualism to a more collective identity, a tribe, a generous community, and you're a leader among equals. In the martial arts mentality here, we very much adopt Bushido, more of a samurai mentality, which is samurai cuts himself first. So you sacrifice before you have your students do something ahead of you. You'll never see me. I'm not going to sit before you sit. I'm not going to eat before you eat. I'm not going to drink before you drink. That's part of the culture and training of more of a martial artist and leader. And then lastly, the 7th generational rule, that's Iroquois. And they thought 7 generations ahead. Okay, we have to think more universally and always keep this attitude of gratitude, hope, and forgiveness. This is where the rage can be a block. You have to forgive. You have to kind of move past that. And then we have some personal steps here that are recommended. But again, I'm happy to share these with you. And this is just the background of why we evolved, or we're leading toward a culture neuropsychological initiative here, or council. We don't have time to go into all of this, but these are hyperlinks to each one of these organizations here. And in addition to Christy and I, we have Annie Reyes, who you're going to hear a lot of in the next few decades. She's going to be one of the leaders in our field here. And these are our mentors. You can see that it's very collective. And these are all the people that have touched us and guided us as we've gone forward here. We very much value them and we respect them and we look to them for guidance. And our vision just simply is we want to affirm more of a cultural leadership in neuropsychology. This is not to divide, but to unite. We have certain values behind that. We talk about the benefits. I think some of that has already been covered here and why we're doing this. But we understand this is a difficult transition here and there are risks. And that is, some folks may view us as maybe somehow stealing from other organizations, maybe making neuropsychology whiter by pulling out delegates from major neuropsychological guilds. This is not that at all. We want a uniform, multicultural organization that can consult to all other neuropsychological guilds here. Because now is critical for all the reasons we've already covered here, and particularly because you can no longer, and one argument can be made, and I'll leave you with this, you can no longer just be a task force or a committee of, because this is Lechuga's perspective. Once you're a task force and a subcommittee of, you're deferent to that board's governance. It perpetuates a certain one down position, in my opinion. And I think we have to do this a little differently. Christy, we're kind of near time.
I think the biggest thing is just we're already a small field and we need to coalesce and come together as much as possible. I think the other thing is sponsorship is so key, especially for those that are coming up the pipeline, and to be efficient. And we have a model or proposed idea for the council, if you want to move forward, Dave, and showing how it can look like, kind of similar to the council or tribal,
Right.
is having everybody coming together, including outside entities, potentially open seats. Yeah, so we wanted to leave you with some hope. I always like to end with that. And so I would like neuropsychology to solve blank to help the world.
Very powerful.
By 2025, when I am blank years old, I want our field to I feel when I think of us making this dream a reality.
Okay. So this is from California Psychological Association. So this is the logo that I wanted. It's
Love it.
little too edgy for some of the other folks here, but I just want to make sure that we go out on the right note here. So thank you all for coming together here. We're going to be more cultural than we have to act in a way that's culturally appropriate and multidimensional, because we're a multidimensional, multicultural population. If you feel me. If you feel me.
We feel you.
Yeah. All right. Got some useful citations. I love Tupac Shakur, man. Biggie Big, Tone Loc, Los Lobos. Music wraps us up culturally, and all of you know that and feel that. So really appreciate you being part of this. And just to kind of move back a little bit to our backgrounds here and reaching us right here. I know we're at the end of time, and this is what's so frustrating, because I know in H&S we always kind of stop and then we have to debrief after all of this here. So we'll hang a few minutes if people can, but I want to honor your time, and we want to make sure that you can move on to other aspects of your day. But thank you very much. Christy, anything?
No, I'm still bouncing. I'm still feeling it.
Yeah, that's good. I tell you, easy to rap to, right? Yeah.
Oh, we're not going to start those battles yet.
Okay, anytime. But you pick the music, I pick the music. We go back and forth. We'll battle a little bit. It's all right. Yeah. Okay. Any Sarah, John, please, Desiree. Yeah.
That was it. And I love that. And I love that you left us with hope. And I love you left us with thinking about all this. I've shared with my students many times that, I'm pretty old. And when I was getting trained in neuropsychology, I had a passion for all kinds of other things, but you had to compartmentalize, right? You couldn't talk about issues of cultural competence within the world of neuropsychology. Those were two separate ways of being in the world, and they didn't belong together. And I just love younger generation of neuropsychologists who bring their whole selves to everything they do.
Right.
Don't feel like they have to compartmentalize. It is so invigorating and so exciting and so wonderful. And I mean that on so many different levels. My students are constantly saying things that amaze me, because they're just like, tell it like it is. And I'm like, wow, I never thought of doing that. That's so great. So I appreciate all of this. And I'll stop talking. So I'll see, are there any other questions?
Well, Sarah, I think it's interesting. I think that it comes back to, are we in a culture where we feel safe to be ourselves? And when we're in a place where we feel safe, just like a home, then we can be free to speak our mind.
Right, but
important for our field to cultivate that, right?
Exactly. But I think it's younger generation of neuropsychologists who have made it safe, because they've demanded that these conversations be had in a way that we didn't even know we could ask. I mean, when I came up, it was very male dominated and all kinds of other stuff. And so I just, anyway, I hear you. It is about having it feel safe. And it's so freeing that that's happening.
I see somebody asking a question about CEs, Dr. Marlowe.
Oh, hi, Wendy. So I think I sent an email about it, and I will send it again. So I think I sent an email yesterday and today with there's the evaluation form you have to fill out and the email address to send it to, but I will send it again today so that it's at the top of your email.
Great.
One question I thought I would just throw out there. I thought, David and Christy, this was just so fantastic and timely, and we so appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise with us. There's many good things to come with the Cultural Council. I'm excited to see where it goes. In clinical practice, one thing that, as you guys summarized so well, our tests are inadequate and were not developed with a diverse population in mind. Our norms are inappropriate to apply in diverse settings, and our research is poor and inadequate. And yet we have a patient coming tomorrow. So the question is, right, like, what advice can you give us? Oh, and by the way, it would be good to speak another language, and so many of us only speak English, right? So we're failing at every level, and yet day to day we're faced with patients. And so it can really be quite overwhelming, even with the best of intentions, of where you really start on a day-to-day basis. So if you could share any insights into becoming more culturally competent in taking next practical steps.
Well, that's a first step, right? Is realizing where there's a limitation. The second is really trusting your good clinical psychological skills, and you not devaluating those, but really placing a premium on your ability to listen, to understand, to take more of an ethnographic personal viewpoint. It's so helpful. And I think the tools, even though they may be blunt, are good. There's some good tools. The norms don't apply exactly, but when you kind of put a tool together with a good carpenter, right, things can work out. So I'd be a little trusting of that, a little forgiving of our field's growth. We're at an adolescent field stage right now, maybe when it comes to cultural neuropsychology, but I would be quite forgiving of our foibles, and really trusting of that nice, great training as a psychologist, and leading with that, and then using the tools to augment your clinical impressions. And I think that's fine. That's a good way to start.
Yeah, I think just to add, definitely psychologist first in cultural neuropsychology. I think the next step is really the cultures that we hang out in. So finding a mentor, if this is something that someone really wants to learn, is cultures learned, right? So just like languages, so it can be taught. We learn cultures, right? My stepmother was Honduran, and I needed to learn. So I was going with her. I lived with her. I learned the music. I learned the dance. I learned how to cook the recipes, right? Even though my biological parents are from another background. Same thing as a neuropsychologist. You can join H&S. You can learn. You can join A&A. You can join SBN. You can find a mentor, you can go to the listservs. And I think that there's, definitely we need everybody to have a stake in cultural neuropsychology. There is never going to be enough, look at those demographics, of Spanish-speaking neuropsychologists in this country, unless we start to give visas and move people from outside of the world to move here. We need everyone to start thinking about learning Spanish, learning Mandarin, learning Arabic. I think we're the few, and hopefully everyone's gonna join with us.
I think, and then I'll be quiet on this here, but I'm so interested in your backgrounds, and I really never accept that I'm white. I don't accept that, because if you really ask anybody their background, it's fairly rich. How they learn this or that, their values, their makeup, how they approach the work. It's really so fascinating. And I find myself getting a little preoccupied with that in a clinical interview. So everybody has these cultural filters that affect how they process being injured, dealing with some of the conditions that we see in clinical practice. And I think that you start there, you evolve that identity, and that makes you sensitive to how you do your work and how you explain the findings that you have in a way that's meaningful to that patient who has a particular worldview. I think those are the tools that we're going to try to reinforce, like through a more multicultural or cultural neuropsych counseling. Okay, I've taken up enough of your time.
No.
Can I jump in? I'm so excited right now. Like, I've learned more about, these are my treasured colleagues, and the fact that we're all in places where we can just bring more, of ourselves. I'm really invigorated and excited. And so a few things came to mind. One of them was that transparency in writing. So I talked about transparency in teaching assessment, being transparent in our assessment report. So if you have reservations because you just crumbled together through a battery, then say that. Say, it appears, and like the best way to move forward here is through repeat assessments under these same conditions so that we can compare later to that if you anticipate change. So the problem comes in when we think that we know it all, right? Coming back to this humility piece, when we think definitively, yes, this is a dementia because, no, I see some low performances here that might indicate that or this or so forth. So there's that. And then David and Christina, like this reimagining of leadership and the way in which you're contextualizing it is so beautiful. And I think neuropsychologists, because we've all drank the Kool-Aid, we've all brought into we respect standardization, right? We've chosen neuropsychology. Neuropsychology didn't choose us. So there are principles of the discipline that we're drawn to. And so it's not typical for us we're like breaking standardization when you say we need a new leadership model. We need a new assessment report model. Whoa, wait a minute, right? Our professional selves are going, our egos are like, whoa, no, that's not how we do things. It's time to reimagine and take off the coats and get a little loose, get real.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Bird.
Love that. All right, so we have in the Q&A box, not a question, but a comment. Thank you very, very much for all the great discussion today.
Well, we really thank the people for coming and listening to us. I loved psychology, always have. And I was in the military for a little bit, and I read Psychology Today, this one introductory text from cover to cover while I was in the military. I read every word, I read every title, I read everything in the subject index, and I read everything in the back. For some reason, I never knew about psychology, but I picked up this book at a book sale. I read it from cover to cover, and I've been in love since. And I think we're just evolving. That's all. So, okay. So thank you very much. And I think we should get off the air here, Christy, so people can get on with getting their drink on a Friday afternoon. All right.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was fantastic to have you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Going to play Tupac now. All right, Dave.
All
thanks.
right, here we go. The West Coast.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Close on that.